Welcome to L'Arte dell'Arme, the Bolognese podcast, where we discuss the intricacies of the Bolognese tradition with the practitioners, translators, authors, and teachers working to bring the art back to life. Today's guest is Ian Davis. Ian studies Italian fencing from the 14th to 16th centuries, including Fiore, Pietro Monte, and later Bolognese and Paduan sidesword methods. He teaches dagger and wrestling at Boston Amrmazare. He transitioned to HEMA from Filipino Martial Arts and Jeet Kune Do, and focuses on bringing Fiore into the modern combative self-defense context. Ian, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, so I'm going to steal a question from Guy Windsor. So whereabouts in the world are you?
I'm here in Boston, Massachusetts.
Nice. And well, I guess that was kind of self-explanatory with Boston Amrmazare, but
Well, I mean, we have people driving down from Maine. Like we've got people coming from all over New England that show up to train. So
that's good stuff, man. So tell me a little bit about your martial arts background and how you got started in Western martial arts.
Sure. So the first, I did. I was like a kid, like a fourth and fifth grader. I did Taekwondo. Moved from that into kickboxing in middle school, and then when I was leaving that middle school, I talked to one of the kickboxing coaches and I said, I'd like to keep doing martial arts. What do you got? And so he recommended me over to the place actually that he trained at. And that's where I got started in Filipino martial arts and JKD. So Inasanto Kali, Dose Pares, Pikiti Tirsia Kali, all of which are like different lineages or systems of the Filipino martial arts. And there's kickboxing, judo, jujitsu, a little bit of Wing Chun, just a bunch of it was an old guys club that I got beat up by old men for like 5 years. And when I was researching the Filipino martial arts, I actually came across a diagram from, I want to say, Carranza. I'm not totally certain which, but it was a Spanish fencing book. And I was like, what? There are books on fencing? And found, I think Marazzo was the actual first source that I looked at back when there was like the William Wilson translation, and that was it.
Yeah.
And so I started digging in, and now it's been, I don't know, that was like 2012.
Yeah, here we are. Almost 9 years.
Yeah, it's a while.
That is a while, yeah. I mean, you've been at this for a long time, and so it seems like over the pandemic you've had like the most productive pandemic of anybody that I know of, producing 2 translations. One of them being the Anonimo Riccardiano, and the other one being Wielding the Light of Mars in collaboration with Connor Kim Cowell.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of led you down the road to getting into translations?
So I lived in, basically I just had a ton of time. So I was a Peace Corps volunteer and I lived in the Andes in Peru. So I was learning Spanish because nobody in my town spoke anything else. And after a year or two with Spanish, I started actually looking at translating some of the Italian texts I was looking at. Italy, so like a confluence of a couple of weird things. The first one is that the type of Spanish spoken in the area where I lived is very like old and formal. Like I've been made fun of a little bit by other Spanish speakers who are like, "Why are you talking like Chaucer? Like, that's weird." But like people, a generation ago, everybody in the area that I lived primarily spoke Quechua, and then Spanish had become a thing, but it was a second language for a lot of people a generation or two ago. And so the Spanish that I've got is a little, well, I mean, it's Campo. It's like rural Peru Spanish. And weirdly enough, that makes it so that I can read a lot of Italian,
Mhm.
not really Tuscan Italian, but I can read a lot of non-Tuscan Italian. So prior to like the Italian Civil War and all that, and kind of the implementation of Tuscan Italian as the main language across Italy, there was a lot of regional variation, and there's something about the northern part of Italy and the Spanish that I learned that really clicks well. The Spanish Habsburgs were controlling that area for a long time. I'm,
Yeah.
I'm not a linguistic historian, so I don't know why, but like after I learned some technical words, I could just read Marazzo, and that got me really into the idea of like, okay, well, can we had enough questions about translation that I kind of became the de facto translation guy at Boston Amrmazare, and then started saying, okay, well, I know how to sit down and work methodically and create books, so let's do that. Um,
Yeah, that's really awesome because I mean I think it's super important. I think every club needs their de facto sort of translation guy, somebody that can go back and look at the text and like, you run into a question and you're like, I don't, this play isn't really working for me in some ways. There's some other way to look at it, and then you have somebody who understands the language in a way that can go and look at it and be like, well, it could potentially be this. Um, you know, the school that I come from, we've got two branches, one that does Italian martial arts and the other one that does more German focus. And we have such an awesome group of like German speakers that can just kind of give lots of varying ideas of what to do with the German. It makes going through things like Talhofer so much easier because everybody has a different take on what Talhofer is trying to say, and various other texts in that regard. So yeah, I mean, I see it as being incredibly valuable. It's something that I'm trying to develop in myself, just because I've had my own frustrations looking at some of the Italian texts. Like, there's got to be something
yeah,
else, some other way to look at it. So that's awesome.
for sure. That's the we'll and like you know translation is definitely an iterative process. So the first generation of translators produce good work and work that can be built and iterated on, but maybe it didn't capture all of the nuances. And when the first translations were coming out a decade ago or more, there weren't, the tools that I've got on hand are crazy. Like Google Translate in and of itself has improved dramatically because of all the
Yeah.
machine learning. And then, like if there's some Russian guy put out like a pictorial collection of Latin abbreviations that appear in medieval Italian texts, right? That didn't
Yeah.
exist. That didn't exist 3 years ago when I started doing translation. So, I think that's the nice thing. As more people come up in translation and learn more stuff about it, I'm really hoping, there's the next generation of people after me who go, Ian got a lot of this wrong here and here, and I'm going to go fix that. And then they produce their own and there's also all that connotation and stuff. Like I think especially you mentioned Talhofer, like those rhyming couplets are not necessarily like perfectly clear. So having 4 or 5 people give different takes, that sounds like ideal for trying to
Yeah.
interpret.
Yeah. And, I mean, I think especially because I think our understanding and knowledge of the systems is also growing. I think that it also allows translators to have a better context for what is potentially happening in an action, and then having a knowledge of various adjectives or things that they can kind of pull from, then they can look at it and they're okay, well, this makes more sense because you know I understand the overall context of what's happening in this action. So this word fits better than other words, and I think
Yeah,
especially coming from like 10 or 15 years ago, I think especially with like the Italian traditions, because now it seems like we're getting Italian translations like left and right, which is fantastic. I mean, we're really starting to get a bigger following and a bigger breadth of understanding of the Italian sources, because more people are actually putting the work into translating those, where 5 years ago it was mostly German sources, and now there are God knows how many German sources on Wiktenauer that you can go look at and get context for other writers and things like that for what they're doing. I think we're starting to get that now with the Italian sources, where we can cross-reference between different sources. Like what you and Connor did with Wielding the Light of Mars is a great example of that, kind of comparing Monte and Vadi, and like, or at least kind of showing the sort of homogeneous nature of those two texts together. I think really helps to provide a better understanding of a lot of what we're doing.
For sure.
Yeah. So tell me about the Anonimo Riccardiano. Like how did you kind of come to like be inspired to translate it, and give me a little bit about its history as a text.
Yeah. So I most of what I'm doing is always swinging back towards Pedro Monte. The Lectinea is massive. It's got all sorts of interesting pieces outside of the martial arts part. But one of the more opaque things is his treatment on the Spadone, which is based in the Levata or the rising blows. And so I dug around and I was reading Italian web pages talking about different texts, and I just said, okay, what has rising blows in it? We had the Anonimo Bolognese that there's a lot of these like falso dritto hand snipes that like stramazzone and hit the wrist, and so the Anonimo Bolognese has all this stuff, and then I think I saw Ken Monshine's translation of the Spadone section of the Riccardiano, and I went and I looked at that section and saw that it was largely, so I'm just hunting around through sources for stuff that talked about rising blows. Found Pagano, found the Riccardiano, read Ken Monshine's translation, kind of read between the lines that there was a lot of jargon going on, and then when I went and looked at the Italian, it's all jargon. It's the text in the Italian is literally like, do the segata and then like leave with a thrust, and you're like, oh, okay, cool, that's handy, thanks. And so that made me, I started hunting around for like, okay, I have this jargon term, the segata, okay, where in the Riccardiano is this reference? And I'm working down through it anyways, and then I said, okay, fine, I'll just write down my translation as I go along. It's broken up into nice, neat little sections. I could give myself like, let me do 5 bullet points today, and then I do those 5, and I do the same the day after, and then it was all translated. It's a weird text, so it's a copy. There's the first actual. So what we actually have is from the Biblioteca Riccardiana in Florence, and it is a professional copyist has produced a copy of handwritten notes. And interestingly enough, the very first page of the actual manuscript is a dude complaining that maybe the copyist like inserted their own understanding. And like, so there's a like DO is an abbreviation in these are all shorthand notes that this thing came from. And so it's like, is it dritto or dentro? So is it from right hand or from the right, or is it inside? And so there's a guy, probably 500 and change years ago complaining about the same stuff that I, as a translator, have been annoyed about, where it's like, write the full word, damn it. Like, don't make me guess what you mean. So that got me hooked on it. The fact that it's a copyist makes it hard to date. So it was, what were the, I worked out of the transcription that had to order it from Italy to actually have it on hand. Battistini and Benny. transcribed the Italian, and offered, they had a lot of commentary on it, trying to break down what they thought the actions were. And they were the ones who actually did the research on, the paper. So it's a copyist, professional copyist would go to a paper shop and purchase paper that they would then copy manuscripts and things onto. And so that paper would have a watermark or other kinds of like little identifiers. And there's been a lot of research around connecting paper to particular manufacturers. And then we can go in and look at like, okay, when did the Venetti family start making paper? Well, they got their license to do that in Florence starting in 1550. And we know the shop shut down in 1590. So we can start really narrowing down the scope. But the fact that it's so the latest paper used in the copy was 1587, which means it was probably, I think the other paper was from like 1564 or something. So the dating of the manuscript is complicated, but we know for a fact, unless this was copied over a long period of time, we know for a fact that it must have been copied by 1587 or thereabouts, because that's when the paper didn't exist yet. Then looking at the style, we have to go back and kind of say, okay, what are the weapons represented here? We've got the sword alone, sword with dagger. We do have swords with various shields, so that kind of opens things up. If it's just sword and sword with dagger, then we're almost certainly looking at a later text as we move towards like the rapier manuscripts of later authors. But we've got the targa, we have the rotella. That's kind of leaning us back towards earlier. Then there's the pike. So pike and shot warfare had become the norm, obviously, by the time this was being written and included. So we're leaning more towards 1570 now. We've got the spadone, and so what do we mean by the spadone? Are we talking about like Vadis that comes up to the armpit, Pietros that comes up to the eyes? Are we talking about Alfieri, who's maybe using like a bearing sword and is clear over into the 17th century? And so it's kind of a spitball guess. I looked at Marco Antonio de Pagano to put my estimate on the front end of 1550. We've got inclusion of many of the same weapons, and so we can tentatively date the Riccardiano 1550 to 1587.
Yeah, and so like the Riccardiano library has an interesting history too, where it used to be a Medici house that was reclaimed by the city of Florence and by the Riccardiano family after the Medicis kind of fell out of power, or at least transitioned their power to more of a ducal power. But some of the things like, and it seems like from there they started collecting documents that were from various families in Florence, and basically just kind of stashing them in the library.
Yeah.
So I think that's really interesting because it kind of almost gives us an idea. And one of the things that I kind of picked up from reading through like the very last portion of the text where he gives his sort of admonitions or his sayings that he has, his 100 sayings. A lot of it reads like somebody who was potentially in the nobility. They were in a position of power, potentially might have even led armies. To me, it actually kind of like strikes me as very Machiavellian with a lot of the things that he says. But it also references Florence as or it doesn't reference Florence specifically, but it does sort of call back to republics and speaks fondly of republics, which is interesting because if it is coming from Florence and I don't know if it's just sort of, a bygone thing where he's just looking back and like, the republic was so much better than the way things are now, or if it's actually identifying Florence as a republic, then that would even put it earlier at like 1526 or so.
Yeah, but so that's the oh man, also from the research of the two guys that did the transcription, a number of the phrases there in the end actually come from a book that must have been published by like 1574, I believe.
Oh,
Um,
interesting.
yeah, so that they're direct quotes from a play that didn't exist prior to that. But now, let me refute that immediately. So this is why this is why the Anonimo Riccardiano is a really frustrating text. Um, who is to say that the handwritten notes that were then copied into the manuscript we have, who is to say they have any relationship chronologically to the sayings,
Right.
right? We know that the fencing material is of a kind, it's written in the same way, but we have no way really of knowing if whoever, they hire a copyist and they got the guy for an extra day or whatever, and they're like, yeah,
Hey, can you throw this in the back of that?
can you just like tack this in? It's some nice handwriting. We like these phrases, right?
Yeah.
Who knows? So I think the other really interesting point about a copyist being involved at all is that the material was deemed worthy enough to hire a professional and pay a lot of money out of pocket to get this copied.
Yeah.
Why was it copied in the first place? Is it so that this individual, whoever hired the copyist, can have their own, it was like with some other family, so they sent the copyist over to produce a copy, and now each person gets to own a copy of the material? Is it that the original was damaged? What if it's conceivable that the original was much older and maybe was deteriorating, and that's why a copyist was involved. But it really comes back down to the same thing of like, I don't think anybody would hire a professional copyist for like my notes from the last several months of class at BA, right?
Yeah.
I'm a guy uh, writing some stuff down, and like Mike O'Brien, our head longsword instructor, is pretty good as a coach, but I don't think anybody 50, 70 years from now is going to be copying want his notes. So that tells us at least a little bit of something about
Yeah.
the who was the teacher, somebody important,
Yeah.
because they took the time and trouble.
I would love to see the receipt, because if we and the Florentines were actually really good about keeping receipts and documenting those sort of things. So, I mean, maybe it's out there somewhere, and we, you know, somebody needs to stumble across it in some random book of records, and some really boring logbook of receipts. Um,
Right.
but then we'll find it, and we'll have this like really awesome piece of information to find out who it potentially could be. I mean, but I can go on all sorts of crazy rabbit trails of who I wish it would be. You
Yeah.
know, who is Tapa of Milan, that's referenced multiple times as being like the greatest sword fighter of like the 16th century? Could this be Tapa of Milan coming down to teach some wealthy dude in Florence how to sword fight? How
Yeah.
cool would that be? Like, we finally have this reference of this, at least some, even if it's secondhand sort of notes of Tapa of Milan. Maybe it is. Um, I don't know. Like, looking at those though, the sayings in the back, and if it is somebody who's sort of writing this from a position of nobility, it actually kind of provides a really interesting counterpoint to somebody like Camillo Palladini. And I was kind of thinking about this as I was reading through it, because Palladini's structured in a similar way. And
Mhm.
in the back of Palladini, he gives his admonitions, and instead of it being like affairs of state and things that you would expect somebody who has some level of influence and power to have, Palladini's talking about what happens, how should you best position yourself if you sit down at a table full of soldiers, and he says a dispute breaks out. Like, how can you get to your sword as quickly as possible? Right? That's a
Mhm.
very common person kind of thing. Like,
Yeah, it's
he's
very
talking.
practical.
Yeah, exactly. And it's really interesting, his advice, because he actually tells you to slam your scabbard down on the ground so it shatters, and then pull your sword out. Which is
Huh.
is Yeah, no, he gives. If you haven't had a chance to read it, go take a look at it. I don't know if you have. Do you have a copy of Palladini?
I don't. I've never looked at
Oh,
him.
oh man, dude, you got to check it out. Okay, so one of the other ones is super interesting because he's like, there's a story of this guy, this German noble. So one of the things he tells you to do is always check to make sure you can withdraw your sword from your scabbard before you leave your house. And then another one, he says you should pull your sword all the way out and check the edges and the tip of your sword, because he relates this story of this German noble who one of his servants ended up doling his sword and shaving down the tip, and then he went out to go fight a duel and had basically a useless weapon and got killed in this duel. And it's the coolest thing. Like, I mean,
Yeah.
kind of like thinking of these things, and these are the things that Palladini sticks in his book, right? And it's like you compare that to the Riccardiano, where you have these affairs of state and all these different things, which one of the things that I absolutely love, since we're on the topic, is his just absolute like throwing shade at the French. That was hilarious.
Where was that in there? It's been a minute since I've
um,
really looked through.
yeah, let me pull. I'll pull out these quotes here. I'll just go through some of my favorites, I think. um, so he's like, the French are impetuous and attacking, and constant, or oh, excuse me. All right, so here we go. The French are impetuous and are more impetuous and attacking than constant and preserving,
Yeah,
right? And then the
yeah.
other one was, the French are more ready to buy than prudent to keep.
I think that's that might actually be useful in dating it, right? Like when was the last time there was real deep common animosity to the French in Italy? Like certainly around the time of the Italian Wars.
Yeah,
Uh,
well, yeah. I mean, and the Italian Wars kind of wrap up sometime in about 1550. So, I mean, that's really the last time that the French are there. And it could be leftover animosity towards the French that's just like,
yeah,
hey,
one particular French guy that the author really did not like.
yeah,
I,
yeah.
you mentioned I think this is Palladini is kind of, I mean, if we like translate him forward in understanding what he's really talking about with checking the edges and the point is like, if you carry a firearm, it's like checking your magazine and press checking to make sure you've got one in the pipe before you walk out the door. It's so there's like a practicality to that that almost suggests lower class in the same way that like Vincenzo Saviolo certainly was. You know, he was like lower nobility and a soldier, but his system is very much about like, put your sword on the right side of your body, gather towards the left side of their body. Whatever happens, shove your hand forward real fast, and then like check if they're dead. If not, reset, proceed again. I think that's the complexity of the actions in the Riccardiano, um, like for me, are a little suggestive of more like the Sala tradition, where it's not necessarily like doing murder with your friends. It's like hanging with the boys and swanging and banging. So, but the inclusion of the pike and the spadone is certainly like very militaristic.
Yeah, and I mean, he even gives like practical advice for like leading armies. Talks about the unpredictability of warfare, and um, you know, how to kind of deal with that unpredictability to essentially not rely upon certain things. Talks about how diplomacy is more effective than combat because combat is so unpredictable. Um, and those things to me are really fascinating because, one, I mean, it's really great advice, but two, it just kind of shows a level of understanding that's pretty interesting. And that's why those things to me strike me very much as Machiavellian, which I think is, you know, just funny. But um, yeah, so like, this text is super interesting because, like, kind of getting into the more like sword specific things rather than just kind of the history of it. It's it doesn't feel, I mean, there is some jargon, but it even feels like some of the actions are a little bit more um explained in a layman's term way. And I
Yeah.
don't know if that almost feels like if that's what really kind of drives it to feel like this is notes from somebody kind of observing a fencing master, but it doesn't, you don't necessarily get a lot of the, like Marazzo, for example, who just kind of invents his own terms for certain things that don't really line up with other texts that we have. Like this guy actually explains the actions in ways that are like really clear and in some ways.
Yeah. I think the jargonization really strikes me as the kind of things that just happens in a club where you've got like people that are trying to communicate information quickly, right? So the one that got me is we have been referring at BA, we call the falso manco beat in Fiore, we call that the shoveler. It's the shoveler because you're doing the exact motion you'd do if you were just shoveling. And you know, in the Riccardiano, there's a section where he talks about making a pala di reverso. So pala is in shovel, a shovel of reverso, and it's definitely a falsetto D, right? Um, so you know, that's fantastic that we created the same jargon that somebody back in the historical period was like, yeah, this makes sense. And that's, you know, it's I need to rapidly communicate a specific action. Shoveler. If I say shoveler, even a completely new person is going to be like this, you know, and they do the little shoveling hand motion, and you're like, yes.
Yeah.
And so all through the Anonimo, the jargon is like that, where it relates very precisely to what you're doing.
Yeah, yeah. That I got the same impression, and I kind of appreciated it a little bit because I feel like, one of the things, as I've told people to go and get the text, some of the things that I've told them is like, hey, this is really cool because he does explain things very precisely. Like,
Yeah,
one of the things that I love is the fact that he has different words for when you're cutting short. When you're cutting short, when you're going for a beat. I mean, we get that a lot in other texts, but it just feels like there are certain things that he kind of outlines where like he's giving you that tactical thing that sometimes is missing from other texts where Marazzo will just tell you to cut a mandrito, and then you kind of have to fill in those little details of whether or not that's a cut short. It makes more sense that you're doing a cut short because let's say you end up on the outside of their sword, and then you're like, oh, okay, well then I need to cut this short, or this needs to basically be a failure. This guy actually like gives it to you specifically, and then you can just figure this stuff out, and then it gives you a better framework for how to approach the other sources.
yeah. You know, I think that's the way that I envision the original text that this was copied from being created was literally like each lesson that some, you know, 16-year-old noble kid is being given by the traveling fencing master. He like runs over real quick and like takes notes. Because there's specificity to it. There's this kind of like illustrative jargon. And ultimately it makes it's there's a very clear progression of pedagogy, which is I think what I'm more interested in. You know, Marazzo was writing for his son Sebastiano, so like the most
Yeah.
frustrating part there is where he's like, you know, the various mandriti and reversi that one can do from this guard, my dear son Sebastiano, so I shall not lay them down because you know them. And it's like, damn it.
Yeah.
But the Anonimo is like lesson one, throwing a mandrito and a reverso. You will throw the first, entering the right foot. You will make a represa. You will throw the second, and you're like, thank you. Thank you for being clear.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So, I mean, the other thing is just the sheer brevity. I mean, nothing touches the Anonimo Bolognese in terms of just like it's how much material is there. This one though, if people are really interested in learning like 16th century Italian sword in one hand, 58 plays, individual plays with a single-handed sword, and 166 variations of those plays.
Yeah,
That's insane. Like
yeah.
absolutely insane.
but you get to actually, right? So that's what I love when I talk about pedagogy. Why I love this text is we're starting from bare bones basic. We build out you say it was 58. It's been nice.
Yeah, 58. Yep.
Yeah,
Yeah.
58 simple plays where it takes you from essentially like throwing basic cuts out to things like the 3 thrusts where we're using complex disengaging actions, right? So by the time you finish those 58, if you really work them, you're competent. And then you get to spend the next 3 years of study working all the different little variations. And by the time you've actually gone through the entire text, like you're probably pretty good. And there's a tactical framework that's baked into it. And that's why I see it very much as like this had to have been someone writing down a well-developed pedagogy from a master who's not trying to conceal anything, right? Like
Yeah.
you paid the upfront fee, so you get the real teaching, not the like Manciolino and Marazzo. I think we're both selling their opera nova to get work, so they can't give you the bare bones absolute. Here's my whole framework approach, because they need you to pay them the 50 lira to really learn this.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, you know, and the craziest thing is like I think it's the sixth play of the third set has 28 variations. It's just like the amount of depth in all of this is just like mind blowing to me because I'm reading through it and I was sitting there and I was categorizing everything, created an Excel spreadsheet and I'm just plugging this stuff
Yeah.
in and I like going through writing out my ideas of like what it is that he's trying to say. And then like, next thing you know, like I'm turning around and getting into the variations and things and I'm like, wow, this is a ton of material. So then my spreadsheet is like growing wider and wider and wider as I'm just kind of like building it out. It's crazy, but I mean it's super cool because I feel like as people really start to study this and get into it, I think it's going to be sort of a cornerstone text that we can go back to and really kind of rely upon to for a lot of people to build out. Like, I mean, the best piece that we have so far for like a beginner study is probably Dall'Agocchie. And we use Dall'Agocchie to kind of feed back into Marazzo and Manciolino, but this might give us kind of a different data point that we can work from to kind of build up into those basic ideas and understand what is fencing in Italian culture. So I think it's really great.
Yeah, and how to I mean, I would love to see someone work with the Anonimo Riccardiano and then actually put the Anonimo Bolognese in some type of rational order. Like I would definitely pay somebody to just rearrange like the Fratis translation so that I can get something that's worth, like it's not all over the map. Like you brought up the six the variations on the sixth play in the third part, so I had to bring that up and take a look at it. And it's of course like it makes complete sense that I would have 28 variations. So that's if the adversary throws a mandrito at my head, I should parry in mezzo coperta inside and thrust to the face, but parry with the point of the sword straight to the right temple, right? So this is like bread and butter basics. You are going to cover the mandrito inside and stick them in the temple. And then that being your base play, anybody who's been doing fencing for a little bit can think of, I'm sure, 30 different variations on that easily to make their, whoever they're teaching run through.
Oh yeah.
Because it's such a
Yeah, and the cool thing is like from that play alone, like he gives variations of, well, what if the mandrito is actually an imbricata? What if this actually comes from a left-handed fencer? And so it's like, it gets deep.
weird edge cases. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, it's just, this is your basic action, but what if all these different scenarios and you just kind of have like this awesome framework to kind of build from. It's super cool. Of course, as I was sort of preparing for this, and really kind of digging into the text, and I mean, this is going to take years of study to to really understand. So I don't want to in any way pretend like I have like a really solid foundation of what it's about, but you do have a lot more work in this, So what do you think is like the tactical framework? I mean, we see a lot of changing steps and things like that. Um,
Yeah.
that you might see in like somebody like Mancilino. You see it in Marazzo when he's fighting somebody that's left-handed. We see it in the Anonimo Bolognese quite a bit with this sort of prevalence of changing steps and initiating actions with impercata with changing steps. So what do you see as like his overall tactical structure?
So I think I'm actually going to pull from Pagano rather than the Riccardiano. Pagano at one point says that all of Italian fencing is the cuts and the falsi. So like I throw my cut and I beat, and all of that with changing the feet. So I wanna basically enter my strike at the very edge of measure where I can hit you, and then I'm no longer there when your riposte comes. So rather than this is probably an unfair comparison, but like I feel like the German tradition, generally speaking, or at least for like the late 15th century glosses and out in the mire, they really want to get into measure and then hang out there in the Krieg and throw combos to distract people and pull them out and then hit the opening, right?
Well, I mean, that leads directly into a quote from Vigiani, right? Where Vigiani's throwing shade at the German fencers, writing to Charles V of all people. And he basically says the Germans will he says, what does he say? It's something along the lines of they'll cut in and then wait for their opponent to do something. And it's like this he basically describes it as taking turns. Like you do
Yeah.
an action, they do an action, you do an action, they do an action, versus like actually trying to sort of lead the engagement in some sort of a way.
Right, and I think that's the Italian framework is definitely for sharps.
Yeah.
Where like Monty talks about, like even in the wrestling that is allowed in Italy, he says that Italian rule sets basically focus on wrestling in a manner that supports armed combat. So even if we're just like you know gripping doublets and chucking each other, we're not going to allow things like a single leg takedown, or at least like a head in front single leg where I'm not controlling the person's body and posture. Because if they have a dagger, they just whip that thing out and hit you 6 times in the back, right?
Yeah.
So even if the wrestling is not allowed to not really be about, with the sharp, I think that's a big influence on the Italian fencing. Whereas, if we're looking at like the Fechschule tradition in Germany, where it's designed, a lot of the material is designed for Feder, and it's designed to help you win and look cool at the Fechschule. Like the Prell House
Yeah.
slapping somebody with the flat. Why does that exist? Because it makes everybody in the crowd go ooh. Right? Um, you don't see that in Italy because they're like, well, I'm taking time to train. I need to make sure I don't die. And so coming to the edge of measure, I enter with my attack, and I'm not there in whatever way I need to be when your riposte comes. And then the other big aspect of this, just had it and I lost it. I've lost it. There's nope, can't get it back.
That's all right. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that you're touching on something that's very interesting because, and this is, I think, another data point that I'm hoping this will help to kind of unveil a lot of the way that we approach things. You're a Fiore guy, so I mean, you would understand this pretty well. But I mean, that's basically Fiore's structure, right? Like, and if Fiore is the oldest Italian text that we have, and could be in some way a representation of what became common fencing in Italy, as some people kind of suggest, this idea that your armazare feeds into your dagger plays, feeds into your longsword, and all three of these are sort of synonymous with one another. And you can basically see elements of like even his guard positions, right? Like even Fiore's wrestling guard positions, like when he's in posta longa and he's got his arm out, I mean, you're basically in a position where like you've got your hand behind somebody's neck, right? And then if you look at the plays and the progressions of the plays, you can take the Armazari plays and find very specific times where Fiore is just doing Armazari but with a two-handed sword, and it, it's super cool. I mean, it all feeds into each other.
Yeah, so
And
that's the congruity, right?
yeah,
Congruity is a really important thing for, like, I've spent a lot of time with, actually outside of HEMA, but like Craig Douglas, who is a guy that he teaches gunfighting in the 0 to 3 foot range. And he goes around, he gets a weekend with people and needs to give them material that they can then work on and be functional with they can train it for a long, long time after. And so what he always talks about is looking for congruity, where I'm not going to teach new actions. I'll teach one action that can then be applied in like 6 different contexts. And you brought up in our messaging before this, talking about like hand parries and things, and
oh
like
yeah,
how wild it is that we're just slapping and moving around sharps. But why teach if I've already taught you dagger parries? Why bother teaching you something new?
yeah.
Simply do dagger parries with your hands. That's it. Goodbye.
Well, yeah. Well, and since I guess we can transition on to this subject, because I do think it's interesting that he does, for people who are yet to sort of get into the text but are interested in the text, one of the really interesting things about the way that the Riccardiano deals with thrusts is with hand parries. Like that's his primary mode of parrying a thrust is with the offhand. And he actually has actions specifically for what happens when your opponent does the wrong thing and parries with their sword,
Yeah, yeah,
right? And he's like, so if your opponent is the kind of person who parries with their sword rather than their offhand, then this is what you would do to follow up, right? Almost
yeah,
like that's something that shouldn't happen, or is just kind of like, is something to look out for, because this is the way that you understand the system, and obviously they don't understand the system that you're kind of working from. So like these are key characteristics that you can look out for. And that just, to me, like that was really striking, because I
well,
know,
it does suggest the norm is hand parry, right? And
yeah,
if we start looking at late 16th century and early 17th century rapier, that is the opposite of Italian methodology. So what happens? What's going on?
exactly. And I mean, so like earlier data sources, like when we have somebody like Manciliano and Marazzo, you don't have any hand parries. You do have hand parries in the Anonimo Bolognese because he has sword and gauntlet.
Yeah,
Um, but outside of that, we just don't see that really kind of show up in the Bolognese sources, where like here we're seeing this as like being the predominance of the action. And it's just kind of striking. I know that there have been conversations in the past about whether or not like hand parries should exist with a cut and thrust sword, something that's really inclined towards cut and thrust. And you can't argue that this system is not 100% cut and thrust, because those first 58 some odd plays, a majority of those plays are all cuts and actions that you're doing with cutting with the sword. I mean, that is the predominance of this system.
yeah.
So, here we have this weird duplicity that we don't get with other sources. And it kind of breaks a lot of the preconceived notions, I think, that existed around what we should be expecting here, mostly because we haven't really had sources that focus on things in this way, um, which
So
is freaking
there
cool.
is one. There's Saviolo. That's what leans me towards a later dating within that 1550 to 1587. Henri de Saint Didier is kind of on the same wavelength. Godinho. And so I think what we're looking at here is the Italian Wars really produced this kind of. I've got a pet theory of this, like the martial art that developed in the camps of the Italian War. There's lots of people from all over that show up and are bringing different regional traditions together, and then the expediency requires that coalesce into something that can be quickly taught, that can get somebody functional. Saviolo's first ward with sword and dagger is I put my dagger straight forward at the level of the shoulder. I put my sword's hilt by my right thigh. I will gather on their left side, and I will try to stick them with a stoccata, turning my hand into fourth, right? If they do the same, I either beat up or down, or I put it over my sword and thrust below my dagger into them, right? That's the method. That's the whole system. And then he's like, if we look at the same word for sword alone, we're using the same beats with the offhand. So, I think there's a niche. I would argue for the existence of this very niche thing that developed from about 1545 to maybe 1595 with the transitionary weapon from what we call a side sword now, where it's a shorter blade cut and thrust. Short is maybe 36 inches. By 1570, we've got like German complex hilted swords with 43-inch cut and thrust blades. And the handling characteristics on those is very weird. It's not quite what I can do with like a 17th century rapier where the balance is shifted way back into the hand. And it's not really what I can do with a side sword because the damn thing's so long that it changes our fundamental handling characteristics. And I think that's what's happening with the Riccardiano is it's really, have you ever seen the work on Saviolo from the 1595 club in England?
I don't think so. No.
Yeah, they kind of dropped off the scene so much. They had some really good YouTube videos 7 years ago. I think they actually got rid of a lot of those, but you can still see it on Chris Chatfield, his YouTube channel. They've really focused in on this kind of like, I put the sword in the center line and then my footwork brings me around the sword rather than me moving the sword. I move around the weapon. And it's really idiosyncratic. And I think those idiosyncrasies are pretty evident in the Riccardiano, at least for me.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I mean you see a little bit of that. You see echoes of that in Manciolino in his stretta techniques. He's very much about kind of like once you come into stretta, then you're not really moving the sword from bind positions. A lot of times you're kind of stepping across or you're doing things that um, you're kind of still trying to maintain that center line focus, which is pretty interesting. Is the more I've gotten into that and the more I've really started to study that, the more I'm seeing that as being something that's a little bit more unique in the way that Manciolino is teaching that. Of course, I prefer Manciolino as my Bolognese source, so I'm a little bit biased. But
He's excellent and clear.
he is, yeah, he's super clear. So when it comes to the Spadone, you're kind of talking about like one of the things that you kind of discuss in the introduction of the text is that one of the things that you were and something that you referenced earlier is sort of this um, uh, mirroring of this lesson that Monte gives us, in the late 1400s, and then we start to see this kind of come around, and that's the use of the levata with the two-handed sword. So, you know, considering your background and the fact that you've studied so much Monte and you've kind of looked at the Riccardiano with the levata, one thing in particular, I've always been a huge proponent of looking at Marazzo's falso dritto and falso manco more as him trying to do the levata rather than throwing Schielhaus, the way that I think a lot of people have kind of started to reinterpret Marazzo.
Is that a
So
thing?
it is a thing. It is definitely a thing.
All right.
It's a big sort of seeing that false edge. Just because he says falso manco doesn't mean it has to be rising. They're taking it as it could be a descending cut. Um,
Oh, well, no. I mean, objectively, if it's going to end in Guardia di Testa, that's almost all the right. I mean, that's the, yeah. I mean, we with the Bolognese, we have to look at what's the beginning guard of the action, what's the ending guard of the action, and if I throw,
yeah.
if I'm going to throw a falso dritto that ends in Guardia di Testa, then how that doesn't follow. I'd be in Beccia Posa or Beccia Sessa or something.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think a lot of that comes from the second guard oftentimes being, him saying and enter, and people taking that as him going into Guardia de Entreri,
Mm,
which is, you know, I I have my own pet theory about that kind of being one of the things where I think now that we understand the system more, that perhaps when Marazzo says and enter, he's not necessarily saying that you're going into Guardia de Entreri. But
yeah,
I need to do more work with his two-handed sword material in order to really kind of flush this out before I kind of really start throwing this idea out there and then, allowing people to criticize it. But that's kind of the course that I'm on, is that, you know, there's a different way to kind of approach this thing. I
mm,
think than the previous understanding that we had when Jurek first released his translation. I think that, people are kind of taking it very serious, like very literally in terms of the way that they're approaching it. Um, but the Levada, you've used the Levada
yeah,
continuously in your sparring, and so, one play in particular that I hate to see, that falso, like that sort of descending falso Drito and falso Manco, is Marazzo's second assault, where he's throwing those actions continuously, right? He throws the
yeah,
falso
yeah,
Manco and then the falso Drito. Um, that to me just reads like he's doing the Levada, and then you cut to the leg, right?
yeah, absolutely. So,
It,
consistency of my take on all of this has been, I'm not going to do anything that I can't find two or three sources that talk about it, because anybody can come up with any kind of McDojo crap they want, but what's if it's good fencing, it's going to appear in several places,
yeah,
and so the rising blows are actually a really interesting thing where you know it's absolutely unequivocal in the Riccardiano that these are rising blows, right? It's the montante. The word levada, levare, to lift up, in Monte makes it very unequivocal. He also uses montante. So does Pagano, defines it as a rising blow. Um, so we've got this kind of rising blow tradition, and it seems to be a very common thing in northern Italy, especially. And I certainly believe that Marazzo is throwing rising blows, not some type of Schielhau-like action. Because of, even if I am going to enter, Guardia de Entrare, the most useful thing I can do to enter from outside of measure is a rising blow that finds their sword, and then I might turn my hands across into Entrare and really pick up that angle. It allows me to bridge distance, and gain position in a way that's what I see happening. But when everybody else in a region is throwing rising blows with the false edge of the sword, it is improbable in my mind that a different author who maybe his verbiage allows for some kind of open interpretation. I think it's highly improbable that one author is going to be doing something different, markedly different from everybody around him. I, looking for that congruity. So the Levada does a number of things that I think are really important, especially with the Spadone. Throwing a descending cut with a big sword. This is I had a lot of different things that I was doing with the Levada until I got a Regagne Spadone trainer that comes clear up to my mouth. And weighs 6 pounds. And suddenly a lot of things that I was doing, for example, true edge, rising blow from the right, that doesn't exist with the Spadone. I think I can say that confidently. And what I would say to anybody who does think that exists, get a 6-pound sword and throw 100 of them in a row. And your wrists are going to feel terrible, right? Like I had all sorts of ideas about what I thought would work until I picked up a big heavy sword. And then suddenly, I think that's part of the problem too with the interpretation of Marazzo. If you're spending a lot of your Marazzo time with a 2-pound fetter, like a modern fetter, I would encourage you to get something of the appropriate dimension and weight, because that provides a very definitive marker that you're working against. We can do all sorts of things when we're just reading and interpreting the text. We need something outside of ourselves that forces certain characteristics of the interpretation. Big heavy sword does that. One of the things it does is when you start throwing descending cuts, you immediately feel how crappy your elbows feel. It's a really good way to get tennis elbow if you're not absorbing it in your legs, pulling your hands into your core. There are certainly ways to throw really steep descending cuts with a spadone and kind of absorb that. And I think we see a lot of people make up for that by throwing more of like a squalembrato, right? It's no longer a fendente. And we just kind of gloss over that fact that it's not following the line of fendente, but it's like, they say fendente, we should probably throw a fendente. And if that doesn't work well, okay, well, what do we need to change? Once we have this outside element, i.e. a correct weight sword, dictating what our actions have to be. Throwing a rising blow with a big heavy sword puts it right in the middle. And then the next thing that happens in this fight, I can quickly cover my head. I think that's a really big argument for the rising blows. Descending ones mean your hands wind up low and people can hit into your opening. Rising blows, especially ones that end in longa or end in guardia di testa, or even in croce, I could throw one from the left and then turn to croce. That's going to leave me in a position of cover with something that's a little too heavy, frankly, to rapidly move around or to snap around in various ways. So the levata, it appears across multiple texts. We're using it to enter and find. We're going to use it to stick. We're going to use it to beat their sword away and then follow up with cuts where it's safe. In application, they've proven to be really useful to me. I at least don't get hit a lot of the time in ways that other types of strikes won't leave me in those positions of cover.
Yeah, and something that I've always really found interesting about the levata too is if your opponent is central and you throw a levata, because it has that element of turning the hands over and providing for that thrust through their cover, it basically goes right up into the armpit. And from a martial context, like you think about somebody who's wearing armor or something like that, I mean that's your primary striking point. Cutting to the head, cutting to the body, cutting to the arms. You might be attacking somebody who has armor on those specific areas. But if you have this predominance of this action that's always attacking weak points and what armor would be, then, I mean, it even seems even more logical. And that kind of brings back to the idea of wrapping this all together and what is the central framework of what it is that we're learning, kind of what you were talking about earlier with Fiore, and how and just Italian wrestling in general, and Monte's idea of Italian wrestling, I think is what you were talking about, how all of it is meant for the battlefield, right? Like the specific actions are meant for the battlefield. And I unfortunately, a podcast that I recorded with Bill Grandy, it didn't end up getting out because the recording got messed up. But one of the great things that he said when I talked to him was, he was talking about how as we continue on in HEMA, we need to start recalibrating our idea of fencing from focusing on the sal. And as people start to explore things like armor, fighting in armor, and the true martial context of this, see how armor actually influences what we're seeing in the cell and the sort of unarmored fencing concepts, because a lot of the things that we think work simply because they work unarmored, we'll find like contextual evidence in the armor sections that show that that's wrong, because the consideration is not necessarily that your opponent is unarmored. It is that this is something that worked in armor, and therefore it ends up back, like kind of filtering back into unarmored fighting.
Yeah, for sure. That's a really big thing that that I've kind of been going on about, and it's certainly an interpretation. I'm not trying to say that I've got like the correct way of approaching something, but like Fiore, when I approach Fiore, I think the two critical things that inform the rest of my interpretation are the wrestling and then armor, wearing armor, moving in armor, getting through armor. And what I like about that, it's the same thing about getting, you know, if you're interpreting Marazzo, get a correct weight sword, get a correct length sword. Why? Because then it's something that's outside of your consciousness that is being used to inform your interpretation. I put on armor and walk around, and I try to do my good Fiorean wide base, and my thighs hurt. The backs of my calves hurt if I'm trying to walk around and stand like that. And then I look at Monte. Monte says use a narrow base. I put my feet together and I pillar my body when I'm in harness. Suddenly I'm not, you know, my bones are carrying the weight. And so then I have to ask the question, all right, where do these wide stances appear? And so that's where I'm actually seeing Fiore, you know, we're talking about the exchange of feet. For my interpretation of Fiore now, I walk around like normal with my feet close in under me until it's time to enter measure. And then when I enter measure, I wind up in a guard, right? Just by that split second, and then I behave out of that based off of what somebody's doing. And that's my evidence for that is my knees hurt when I'm running around in armor and I'm trying to do wide stance stuff. Narrow stance, real good in harness. When we look at our dagger interpretation, you know, people like to throw those big strikes that come from above and descend down into people. Put some mail on a punching bag and try to break through mail with that, with your arm disconnected from your body. It doesn't work.
Yeah.
Like I have an immediate, you know, like if I throw my dagger strike where I'm coming from way up high and I descend down into it and I'm not able to really sink mass and be attached to it, I don't get through good mail. But if I keep my elbow attached to my body and I punch straight forward with my kind of like a tight hammer fist, and I sink my weight through, you hear links pop and you've put 6 inches of dagger right into the bag, right? So now my mechanics are informed by not what I think about the subject, but I've tried it and it worked or it didn't. And now we have to go back and kind of rewrite. We were using couching and driving in armor. Doesn't work. I have to compromise a link first. If I just place my point and couch the weapon and try to drive through, it's not going to work. I have to ballistically cross in, compromise a link, and then I can couch and drive, and I'll be able to break that broken link, right? So with the Anonimo, it's the same thing. We really got to figure out what sword am I supposed to be using? Am I supposed to be using a big cut and thrust, kind of like proto rapier? Am I thinking more of like what we see in the Bolognese text? I think that's going to be critical to identify to then work out good interpretation.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important. I had a similar journey when I was trying to cut with sharp side swords and really focusing on like, okay, what are the body mechanics here? Because looking at Marazzo in particular, the squall and Brazzo as a cut, um, it doesn't necessarily work as well as a cleaving cut as people potentially imagine. That 45-degree cut doesn't matter what kind of sword you have. The way that Marazzo describes it is kind of is awkward to try to actually get a good cut. And when I started doing what Manciolino was talking about, where Manciolino talks about the cut, like his fendente going from the ear down through the knee, that's a much steeper angle. I mean, that's like 70 degrees roughly. And dude, you can cut anything, cutting like he describes, right? Like it's like it's super easy. And I'm thinking to myself, like, then he says that you can sort of change this and allow for variation as he goes through, but teaching that as the fundamental is completely different than basically trying to form fundamentals around something that's a little bit more ambiguous in the way that Marazzo is and what he's trying to do. Like for constraining actions and trying to control your opponent's sword in some way, sometimes those 45-degree cuts might work, but when you're actually going in to try to hit somebody, you want to make sure that you have that tight descending angle. depending on the target, of course. Like, I mean, if you're cutting to the shoulder, that makes sense. You want to have that angle. If you're cutting to the neck or to the side of the head or the temple or something like that, you want to make sure that you're kind of coming down into it. But um, I just see that as, I mean, it goes back to that sort of concept of triangulation and really trying to triangulate everything that you're doing and make sure that you're feeding the proper pieces into the machine that you're creating. If the text is the machine, if you're not giving it the right materials to try to get the right outcomes, then you're going to come up with artificialities that aren't necessarily true to the text.
Yeah, for sure.
But yeah, so let's see. I forgot to ask you, but since you have kind of dipped your toe in the Arno, and you've got this Firenze fever now, what will it take to bribe you to translate Altoni?
Oh man,
I'll
so
even
much
send you a copy.
I have it. I have one back here. Um, uh, I don't see that happening, especially since I know at least one person who I trust to be producing a good translation is working on it. And he's actually
Hey,
working.
awesome. Okay.
He's going to school for history and is currently working on the Altoni translation. I'm not going to name drop him just in the event that he I don't know, loses interest and
Yeah.
walks away. I think there are a number of working on Altoni, and it won't be too long before we get there. And thank God for that.
That's good.
I really don't want to do it.
I want to see the development of this Florentine system. I want to see this kind of come about and have better framework and understanding for it, because Docciolini to me is actually a really interesting text, and that he has this sort of predominance of grappling, and that's kind of his core thesis, is working into getting to a grapple with a single-handed sword.
That's
And I would love to see what
very.
else he has.
Yeah, I think Altoni might, just from perusing, I think we're going to see a lot of that. I think that's very Spanish, right? It's moving into the movement of conclusion and gaining control of the sword. But we've had the Bolognese school, and I think the Riccardiano, Lavino, and Altoni certainly can be grouped. And then we have a different flavor of and Docciolini, and a different flavor of the approach. But they still love circles, so
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean,
it does a lot of good.
what's Italian fencing without circles, man?
Yeah.
I mean, you got to, Even Palladini. I mean, Palladini, he's the forgotten source, but I will always,
You,
I'll be a
you
huge.
piqued, you piqued my interest. I pulled it up, and I'm gonna have to take a look through here. It looks like Terminiello did a good
Yep.
translation, Palladini. All
Yeah,
right,
and it's a beautiful book too. It's totally worth it.
I'll have to get it.
Yeah, it's good. I mean, he combines in some ways, because he was from Bologna, but he was also studying in Rome in the 1570s or 1580s. Um, he really kind of encompasses a lot of Italian fencing in a way that's pretty fascinating, because then he basically gives the exact same description of his footwork as what Docciolini and Altoni give. So he has the same image, and basically says, every time you make a parry or something like that, that back foot needs to come around to the outside, that outside line, the B or C, I guess, to is that how it goes? I can't remember. It's been a while since I've looked at Docciolini, but the way that he describes it, it's the exact same thing, in the way that he describes it, which is pretty fascinating and interesting.
Yeah.
So that's good. At least there's hope for Altoni getting out there, even if it's not, you know.
So trying. I mean, so that just this will be a slight digression, but I remembered what I wanted to say about the tactical framework.
Okay, yeah, go for it.
One second for that. So Monty gives us this idea of whenever you want to throw 2 blows, you should actually throw 3. And so there's a provoker, a hitter, and then something that covers your retreat. And I think that really encompasses, besides the changing of feet and the always minimizing, you brought up Dacciolini, always trying to turn that foot. What are we really doing there? We're using angles to minimize our entry into where we can be hit, right? I'm circling that rear foot because although my point lands, the only thing that's still in danger is my hand, and I'll recover that hand back out of measure. And now you have to take an extra half step to follow up and hit me. And so that combined with, I think the Anonimo, the Tre Punta is a really good example of that theory from the Riccardiano, where I'm gonna feint, and then I'm gonna hit and recover. Like that really nails down the trapping people into tempo, and then hitting and recovering in a way where they can't touch us on the way out. And I think that really nails down a lot of the Riccardiano's tactical framework.
Yeah, and that's something that we see, speaking of, and maybe something that people should really kind of go down a rabbit trail for, if they want, is you actually do see that a lot show up in the Bolognese sources. Like if you look at Manciolino, that's basically what he does for a lot of his offenses with sword and small buckler. That he's oftentimes giving like those 3 attacks. If you look at the way that he retreats in his defenses, there's always a cut to cover. Of course, Marazzo, there's always a cut to cover. That's basically what the Mandrito Traversato is, or the Reverso Traversato.
And
that's
the falso dritto. I think that's where the levata really shines, is where, as I'm exiting measure and I'm withdrawing the hands, it feels very much like, you've got a free road to come in and thrust me. And the moment you extend your sword, that high edge cut just right in the hands,
No,
so
it's tough.
Entering and exiting, that's really where you see the levata, throw a rising blow to find the sword, so I can then get in and do those thrusts to weak points you're talking about. And then I'll just punish you if you follow me on the way back out. And that's really nails down that final part of that cycle, right? The provoker, the hitter, and then the blow that covers us. As I'm exiting measure, if you try to follow me with your hands and therefore with your weapon, I target stuff.
Yeah, that's really good. So, we've talked a lot about tactics, and sort of strategic approaches of really Italian fencing in general, which I think has been really fantastic. Some of the other questions that I'd like to ask, like, what are some of the biggest things that you've come across in developing your, what are some challenges that you faced in developing your interpretations, and have you overcome them?
Yeah, so I think for me, the thing that it's always going to come back to is finding solid ground to stand on. In all of anything I've been looking at or working through, I come up with, there were years there where consecutively I'd have a basically totally new framework over and over and over, where I'm like, oh, I don't believe whatever I believed before. I'm going to come up with this new way of looking at it. And that leads you, it's kind of fun. It leads you all over, but it doesn't necessarily give you teachable stuff or repeatable stuff. And so then the biggest thing that I've come to in interpretation is trying to contextualize whatever I'm looking at into a particular sociocultural framework, and then trying to find pieces of data outside of myself that will nail down elements of whatever I'm working on. So for example, Fiore, we've got like 1v1 murder duels and fighting at the barriers. And those are the 2 main contexts where this is going to be done. We've got wearing armor, moving in armor. We've got getting through armor. I need to make sure that whatever I'm doing will actually legitimately pass through mail. because if it or will put me in a position where I can like lift things up and get in under it. So that's how I approach Fiore. With like Monte, I got kind of the right tool. He tells me, you know, what size sword I should be using for his Spadone material. And I was coming up with interpretation after interpretation that could be valid. But the moment I got a 6-pound sword that came up to my mouth, suddenly half of them didn't work. And then I could just run it over and over. And when my body starts feeling bad, because, you know, I don't know, the way I'm recovering is putting too much force through my shoulder. I have to adapt what I'm doing to this externality, the big heavy sword. And so it's more of a general approach. I think Charles Lynn talks about that too, with like interpreting historical stuff. He likes to actually get the thing and do whatever the thing is described with it. So like medieval camping, he'll get like exacting reproductions, and then he'll go put himself in bad situations and then camp, right? And he learns a lot from doing that. And so that approach of like establishing your externalities, I think, is a really that's what has changed my approach to interpretation, is locking down those fixed points, and then I get to work off of a real base and not something that's just constantly shifting.
Yeah. Yeah, I just thought about something that we had talked about earlier. Like it really hits on a thing that if I wanted to write a PhD thesis, which I don't because it's not, it wouldn't be any good for me right now. It like just the idea that I think a lot of the sources that we end up seeing end up being created. We see like a prevalence of sources being created, highlighting the type of warfare that we see at specific times. So for Marazzo and Manciolino in particular, I think of the latter portion of the first phase of the Italian Wars really influencing their work and how they wrote. Marazzo's the fact that Marazzo tied himself to Guido Rangoni in the way that he did kind of indicates that there was probably a deeper relationship between the two, other than the fact that he just mentions that they studied together. Um, and Guido Rangoni's participation in that first half of the Italian Wars um, kind of shows that there's a chance that Marazzo might have been there with him as his fencing master. Maybe that's why he was the fencing master general. But we see a lot of texts kind of follow after these like large periods of conflict, and then there's the kind of the second phase of the Italian Wars, which I think you were referencing, and how like perhaps a lot of what we see with these hand pairings, things like that, kind of stemming from that. With Fiore in particular, Fiore kind of like comes at the conclusion of the Age of Great Captains. Well, actually, I mean, he's like in the midst of the Age of Great Captains, but it's clear that he's writing about something, a system of sword fighting that was like prominent throughout that, and was like, this was something that he was highly regarded for in that period. Vadi might be a sort of fanboy of sorts, but there were still elements of conflict going on when Vadi was writing. The interesting thing about like Vadi and Pietro Monte in particular is that's kind of the transition from the Age of Great Captains being predominantly German and English to the Age of Great Captains transitioning to being predominantly Italian. And a lot of the sort of usurpations that end up happening, like with the Sforza and things like that, sort of the realignment of Italy, and that's kind of what informs those two. And so the I guess what I'm getting at is like we see this variation of style sort of played out through these historical examples, tying it back to that and understanding the context of warfare at that time, and why these conflicts inform those and the way that they kind of play out. Like what was the style of fighting at the time, like what was predominant. You talked about like the pike kind of being an indicator of like perhaps putting this at the height of the pike which kind of makes it a little bit later. Like those sort of elements I think are pretty fascinating, because again, like even with somebody like Palladini includes the pike. When he talks about using a halberd, he says it's just for, if somebody hands you a halberd and tells you to protect the doorway, that's, you need to know how to use it. But that's his context for when a pike would be most prominent, or not a pike, but a halberd would be most prominent. um and that's a different context I think than we see and that we kind of think of in terms of how these things were kind of going about. But you know again, going back to the admonitions of Palladini, him talking about carrying a sword in the way that he does, telling somebody not to wrap their cloak too tightly around them, around themselves, talking about sitting at a table full of soldiers, and the potential conflicts that could arise. um, it's just such cool information that if we really tried to like build these frameworks around and like extrapolate this information to create these funnels of knowledge, I think we'd just be in a better place. um, and I agree with you on that. And then, you know, context clues, looking at the full picture.
Yeah, I think it really goes deeper than that in a lot of ways. I think there's understanding that the context in which these particular arts developed also could inform how we do competition. I think that's a really big thing, and fighting is important. It's how we actually determine the validity of an interpretation. If you have an idea and then you go out and you just get wrecked for it, probably not a great idea, you know. Um,
Right.
and so, like, I'd be really interested in uh, now that I have armor, I really want to do like a fight at the barriers. I'm research what does that look like in pretty exacting terms. Build a field that fits what Fiore would have been fighting in. Collect roughly the same set of weaponry, and then fight it according to whatever the rules were that we can find. Same thing for the Fectula. Like, I would love to see people working with fetter that you can bend the tip all the way around and touch the pommel. Right?
Yeah.
That's a
Yeah.
very different kind of fetter.
It is. Yeah, for sure.
And the content, if you're doing Meyer, then that's why don't we organize our, as we understand context, it's not just the context in which the art developed for actual use, it's also the context of how did they train it, how did they compete in it, because people love competing. They did then, they do now.
Yeah. So it's interesting you say that. We just Triangle Sword Guild, we just had an event called October Effect, and this year we had a group that got together and really started researching judicial duels. And basically what they did is they pulled all of the judicial duels from Talhofer, Paulus Cal, and there's another text that I can't think of off the top of my head, but they really found, like, I mean, they went through and basically created this structured judicial duel for two people to fight in, all the way through for the pageantry, the rules, like the sort of the etiquette of the crowd, the expected etiquette of the fighters. Um, they had seconds, the role of their seconds, like how that played into the things. Like we built barriers, so they fought in barriers. Um, and this ended up being this really fascinating thing, because like a lot of the KDF practitioners, because this was a German rule set, were like, wait a second, this actually kind of helps me understand Versetzen and in the context of Versetzen and how it's used, because one of the rules is if you are the defendant in the case, you cannot strike the first blow unless the
Mhm.
fight has been reset. And so what we ended up seeing in this fight is you have one person who's allowed to strike and do anything, and you have this other person that's basically just defending themselves, waiting for this strike to come in.
Yeah.
And their best opportunity is to catch one of those blows and actually like
Counter.
provide a counterattack.
Yeah.
And Yeah, and so it created this really intense situation. And the other thing too is the person who was the sort of the claimant in this affair, like they could actually get really close to the other person. Like they could just drive up on them because the other person can't stab them, they can't cut them, right? So they could do whatever they want. They can get right up in their face, and the other person cannot assault them until they attack them. And so you have like this weird exchange of measure where you have these two people kind of playing with this measure that they never had the opportunity to deal with before.
Yeah,
And it just creates this really wild situation. It was the craziest fight I've ever seen in my life, but it was also the coolest fight that I've ever seen in my life
perfect.
because you could feel the tension. Like you could seriously feel the tension throughout the entire thing. I mean, I think it lasted like a good like 35 minutes before somebody actually landed a blow, but it was super intense the entire time.
Yeah, we did IGX this past year. A guy from BA, Adrian Gunn, he decided he wanted to do a one-hit kill tournament. So try to mimic essentially, Fiore says he fought 5 duels with just a gambeson and chamois gloves and his sword and God and no friends, etc. And
Yeah.
he fought 5 times and acquitted himself, right? So what we did was the tournament was one-hit kill. And by that we mean if you lose in the first round, you're effectively dead and there's no like pool that you're going to go into. You're just done. We defined what a killing blow would be, descending cut onto the computer, thrust to the computer, thrust to the center of mass. Um, Cuts to limbs, if we defeat your tenure as a fencing master is pretty much over if a falso dritto just removes half your left hand. So we
Right.
defined all these conditions. It was so much fun because we were doing rawlings and daggers, dagger on the belt, rawling in hand. So people could get a little goofy with it, but you felt it. The tension just got deeper and deeper and deeper as we go along here. And Fiore is suddenly what everybody's doing. Even if they're ostensibly a KDF practitioner, not a single Meister howl was thrown. Because strong side cut, strong side thrust, and beat their stuff away from the left becomes what you do when you're like, oh my God, I'm about to eat this like thrust to the face. And that's it.
Yeah.
And so we can come up with kind of that's what I'm talking about with like how we organize our competition can mimic very particular context. Like we could do Sala fencing with the Spada da Giaco, where we're trying to look real pretty and have everybody in the crowd go, oh, yes, and like give us the applause. Or we can do back alley, me and some guy from the other town are like sweet on the same woman. So we meet outside of the walls and engage in a 1v1 murder duel, right? And then in that case, we're not going to do points. We're going to do like fencing with the sharp sword. So, same type of thing we were talking about with the one-hit kill tournament. What if it's disabling? We can assume I'm going to get murdered in the next few seconds. Or it's like an insta kill. And suddenly all of the like, we use the buckler and the clay sword to look pretty in front of the crowd, and then we've got our large buckler and spada da filo, and there's like 5 things we do across
Yep.
all of the Bolognese texts. When they say
Yep.
spada da filo, it's shoveler, it's thrust, and it's
Yep.
strong side cut. That's it. That's all you're doing.
And that's honestly that's why I prefer Manciolino to Marazzo, because of his sword and large buckler material. It's concise. Like I had a student visit from out of town, and we were going through his defense against the thrust material, and he was like, "Yeah, this is all kind of simple." And I was like, "Well, yeah. I mean, that's the point.
Yep.
That's exactly what Mancini is going for. It's simple because you're literally he's telling you you're fighting with a sharp sword because this is an earnest fight. It's different. Like people say that Fiore is simple, and I'm like, well, yeah, of course it's simple. It's simple because it needs to be concise. That's exactly what you want in an earnest fight. You don't want to think I'm going to go through this play and this progression, and you know, like you think about Marazzo and some of his progressions that are just like kind of ridiculous, and I'm like, of course I would never try that. And like, you know, you do it in a tournament and you're like, every once in a while you get it to work and you're like, all right, yeah, this is great. But, you know, from a like when especially, so this is another really cool anecdote from Palladini. One of the things that he says is that when your opponent parries in a dispute, talking about an earnest fight, it'll always be with more force than when you're fighting with your fencing master, right?
Yeah.
So when you're fighting in an earnest fight, they're always going to give you more of a push, more of a feel. Their parries are going to be a little bit wider because they're going to overreact because of the circumstances,
The
right?
real
And
danger. Yeah.
the real danger, exactly. So they're not going to give this nice tight parry that like the thrust goes like 2 inches away from their head. That's not how it actually happens in a real fight. And a real fight, they push that down and it creates a bigger opening, you know?
Yeah. That thing's
So
scary.
exactly. I mean, you're about to get impaled in the face, you know? You don't want that. You don't want to eat
Yeah.
that. So,
That's where,
yeah, I
like, sorry, go ahead.
no, no, you go ahead. I didn't really have any.
But
Yeah.
coming from this is where I'm really interested in the training tools that we're using, and you know, like coming from a Kali background, Pikiti Tirsia still regularly trains with live blades because that's important. Now, when I say that, people aren't doing. When I say that, people are like, "That's insane," and then you're like, "Well, no, hold on. Let me explain. What we're talking about, like we've
Every
learned."
fan every fan of Vigiani right now is just like pumping their fist. They're
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
exactly what Vigiani says.
Yeah, because so we'll do like a preset drill, right, where you actually put your index finger out and your thumb up to give yourself little blade guards, where I make sure I'm not going to cut my friend on accident. But then we run. We've been doing like the Sabayan drill, right, one of the drills from Pikiti Tirsia, and we'll just do that at a pretty good clip, not crazy, but like a pretty good clip with sharps and a high degree of technical specificity. Um, and we'll do that with, but when you're like banging, and when you put on the lacrosse gloves and the fencing mask and have a stick, and that's your quote blade stand-in. So let's go back to the 1500s, right? How did they train? Did they have like you look in Meyer, he's working in the background of a number of the dagger plays. People have what look like sharp daggers, right? And they're working these grips and reaching in and grabbing and manipulating shoulders and controlling that weapon to the ground. Maybe they were rebaited, we don't really know, but we see all these little references, the spada da Giaco versus the spada da Filo. We've got Vigiani saying you should train with sharps, like a lot of the time. How do I do that safely, right? Because it's not good training if people are getting injured. So clearly there's kind of a, in the modern world, you look at like live fire training with firearms, right? There are ways that you do that are intelligent, safe, and build good skills for actually fighting with guns. Surely they had those training methodologies, choices in different, yeah, they use the sharp, but are they going really hard? Probably not, because if I get wounded, that's not useful to me. And if
Yeah.
I'm, uh, but maybe we grab rattan sticks that are the same length as our swords, and then we fight really hard with the rattan stick because I'll get bruised, but that'll be fine. It may suck for a week or two, but I'll be better. And then I know what a really hard fight with a weapon looks like. We see that with the Battaglia in Venice, where they do rattan stick. Probably it's Conde India. We don't. That's either the grass or it's probably rattan because they had trade routes. And they get up on a bridge and just wail on each other like crazy. So there's that context. There's the sharp sword training. We have to put all that together and try to not just figure out what we're supposed to be doing, but how we train it to be effective in the real world, ideally.
Yeah, I honestly, I would highly encourage anybody who does Bolognese fencing, does a lot of sword forms and kind of recreates a lot of the plays and actions from the text, to do those sword forms with a sharp sword.
Yeah.
Because it gives you a different feel the first time you do it. I mean, I'll never forget the first time I went out there with a sharp side sword, and I was like, I'm going to go through Marazzo, and I was so careful. Like, I mean, because I didn't have the training and the context of what it actually meant to have a live sword in my hand. If I
Yep.
hit myself in the back of my head with a feather,
Yeah.
whatever. I just hit. It hurts a little bit, but when I've got a sharp sword, I'm actually thinking about that. And then it changes your perspective every time you go out there, because you're thinking, okay, I felt that sword blade go through my hair, but that's cutting it a little close.
Yeah.
So what am I going to do when I do this again with a sharp sword? Do I need to make this action a little bit bigger? Do I need to reconsider this action a little bit and the way that I'm doing it with my body mechanics? Am I doing this too close? You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
and it
That's
changes
the
a lot of things.
I actually got it here with me while we're talking. I got this rondel recently where it's more of a civilian carry one. And it's basically got a straight razor grind on it. I mean, it's deeply, deeply hollow ground. And you see that the whole rondel daggers don't have edges. That's not real. You go look at historical pieces. A lot of those edges are so thin, they've just completely rotted off, but they're there, right? There were these deep
Yeah.
hollow lines. Part of our dagger curriculum, I had people pinning hands down low and then cross chambering to the left shoulder so that they could throw a reverso. I'm playing with the shark, and the moment I'm like 4 inches away from my forearm as I pull that blade past, but then I'm immediately like shaking my left hand, like, ooh, I don't,
Yeah.
I don't like that. And it makes me. I went back in, and sure enough, if my left hand is above my right hand, I only ever pull up and strike the face or chest, meaning I do a mandrito. Why? Because shark. It's scary. I'm not going to drag that thing across my own arm. Like, that's dumb.
Yeah. So, but that also gives you more context too for like the tactical approach of some of these fights, right? Like, I mean, there's so many considerations that I think that those things help to provide, because when you understand the limit of that, then you would know exactly, like, you have a better context of, if you see somebody in that position, that's what's coming at you. Um, one of the things I love about Marazzo's dagger section at the end of his book is it's the only section where he says if somebody's coming and trying to murder you, which is super interesting, because why is he giving us this context where he's like, like, this is the only life or death thing that he specifically says that this is life or death, and it's all of his dagger plays.
Yeah. Well, that gets back into the mediation of violence, right? Like the nowhere in the world now or historically has there been totally unmediated, quote unquote, perfect violence, right? Like there's always, we can look at, there's modern, in Brazil, kitchen knife and towel is still a thing that people do. Where we're basically doing Marazzo's cloak and dagger, but with like a big old butcher's knife and a towel wrapped around our forearm, right? And you can watch real fights of people actually engaging in this type of like combat with sharps, and you will see neither person really wants to do murder. Um, like rarely, like you're doing this big, like, we're making gestures, we're working in. Somebody gets popped, and they're like, "Ow, ooh, I don't like that," and the fight's over, and both people kind of like separate and start slinking away, because the point was to like acquit yourself honorably. Effectively, it was to show that you stood up to somebody, you faced off with sharps, and then when the injury happens, people say, "Bet that sucked. Okay, I'm gonna leave now, and go get this like patched up." And surely that was part of the context of Italian fencing. And like, I mean, heck, there are still extant peasant traditions using sticks and knives and razors and things. And so like the mediation of violence too is an important thing for developing technique. Like why are we slapping people with the a good example, the Anonimo, where the flat is used in various ways, right? Like why specify the use of the flat? You know, we can go to Germany and look at some of their laws where you had to engage with the flat first. If you tried to cut somebody with the edge initially, you were going to jail, right? Like it's you really escalated the level of force, so you know that's a problem. So you have to hit with the flat first. So it's all context and mediated.
Yeah, which is really interesting. I mean, that's kind of like what we see too with Talhofer and his duel, where he was shamed for cutting somebody in the hand, or something along those lines. I can't remember
I
what
think
it
he
was
got cut in the hand.
specifically. But,
If
well,
I
yeah,
remember,
he got
yeah,
he was throwing spheric goes, yeah, and he got cut in the hand. Yeah. And they ended up
his
both getting shamed, right? Because he got hit and therefore he was shamed, and the other person got shamed because he hit him in the hand.
yeah,
Is that right?
yeah, yep, I
Yeah.
believe that's correct. And then in the version of Talhofer that was later than that date, I think there's a specific note about like watch out for the hand hit, which is just hilarious, right? We can sort of track Talhofer's life from the evolution of pedagogy.
Oh, fucking Talhofer. Is that why he always draws everybody getting their hand cut off?
Maybe he really wants to emphasize that fear.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, so I mean that takes it, just like tying it back to the Riccardiano, that again raises a question for this kind of mysterious book. What is the specific context? Are we talking about a spada da gioco? Are we talking about fighting in earnest? Are we talking about acquitting yourself honor? You know, like you look at Da Cialini, where the thrust is being directed to the shoulder. Um,
Mhm.
A, because that's where all motion comes from, but B, if I wound you in the shoulder, I've drawn first blood, and we both get to back up to our corners, and you know we've acquitted ourselves honorably, and we get to go. So that, and section by section, is the Spadone for Monte basically says the two-handed sword is for exercise. Um, like he certainly does not center it as his like primary weapon in any capacity. And there's at least one chapter where he says, "Hey guys, train with the Spadone and the poleaxe. We know you don't wanna, but really it's good for you." So is the Spadone here for exercise? Is the Spadone here, you know, Alfieri, certainly the Spadone is for defending the banner and clearing out streets and stuff, because he tells us that that's the context. But I think it's really open to interpretation with the Riccardiano, and that's why I kept it really minimal on commentary, because I think a lot of other people are going to need to mess with this and try to figure those points out.
Yeah, no, I mean, and I think that's really cool. And I don't think that we can extend our appreciation for you putting that work in and kind of starting the ball rolling on this text, because, as I, I mentioned earlier, I really do feel like this is going to be something that we're going to start to see as a cornerstone moving forward, and understanding Italian martial arts. And I might not feel that way in a few years once I really become familiar with it, but I don't think that that's going to happen, because having already looked through it, there's certain things that I've just been like, wow, that makes a ton of sense, and that really helps me understand X, Y, and Z from Marazzo or Manciolino or anybody else. So I'm super excited about it. And I think the greater HEMA community for Italian martial arts is going to be really appreciative of you, for really putting in that work, because it's going to be awesome. But
Very true.
it's probably a pretty good place to wrap things up. Thanks for coming on and talking to me about this stuff, because this has been an awesome conversation. I've enjoyed the heck out of this, and I
Yeah,
know
you.
um, I learned a lot, and look, man, anytime you're down in the Raleigh area, you're always welcome to stop by and come train with us, or we'll get you coming down
And
here
that
maybe for
concludes
some
another
events and
episode
get
of
you to
Le
do some
Arte
classes.
dell'Arme, the Bolognese podcast.
It's been awesome to kind of get to know you.
I want to thank Ian again for coming on and sharing his
Same to you.
thoughts with us, and really kind of getting into the Anonimo Riccardiano.
With Connor.
It's such a cool text, and he's a really cool guy. I really enjoyed that conversation. Very grateful to him for the work that he's done throughout the pandemic. It's been a while since I've done a podcast, but I think here and there I'm going to try to get a few more episodes done. I've thought a lot about how I want to continue to approach this thing, and I might do a few solo episodes, just kind of getting some of my thoughts and ideas about the tactical approach to the Bolognese system out there. I know one of the things that I do want to do and might have coming up pretty soon is a follow-up conversation with David Biggs about stringere and the concept of stringere of space, playing with Manciolino and Manciolino's system. I've come to some conclusions and some ideas that really highlighted and kind of emphasized for me exactly what it was that David was talking about when I had him on the podcast that I wasn't very familiar with and I didn't quite have an appreciation for. But now that I've really gotten into the depths of the tactical approach of Manciolino, I'm starting to really appreciate what he had to say. So I kind of want to follow up and talk to him. If I can get him a time scheduled to come on the podcast, then I might do that. But in the meantime, getting through the holidays and everything like that, I hope everybody has a happy holiday and a Merry Christmas. We'll see what comes in the new year, and we'll see if a few more episodes of Le Arte dell'Arme may drop in the month of January. But until then, stay tuned for that and stay saucy, my friends.